Dad leaned into my doorway that morning with grease still on his hands from the shop. He held out his credit card and a small scrap of paper where he had written the PIN in block letters. Ione. Can you order that Belova watch for me tonight? Website gave me trouble. Just charge it here. I nodded, already half lacing my boots for work, and set the card on my desk beside the scrap of paper. The day at the port dragged long-delayed containers, a customs call that refused to resolve, and a supervisor with no patience for mistakes. By the time I pulled into our driveway in Bixby Knolls, my eyes felt like sandpaper. All I wanted was a shower and sleep, but I remembered the watch. I booted up my computer, entered the details, and hit submit. The screen flashed red transaction declined, insufficient funds. I frowned. Dad wasn't careless, and that card was for important purchases. I tried again. Same message. Confused. I checked the balance page. What stared back was not a few hundred for a watch, but charges stacked in bold high-end clothing stores on Pine Avenue, an airline ticket confirmation, a non-refundable beachside reservation. The floor creaked and Sabine breezed in, swinging a glossy bag as though she were fresh off a runway. Her jeans sparkled under the lamp, new tags dangling from her blouse. She tossed her hair and smirked. You like and tomorrow I'm off to Huntington. Needed a break. My mouth opened, but the absurdity of it struck first. She had actually done it, lifted the card, read the PIN, and burned through thousands as if money grew on the jacarandas outside. Against every instinct. A laugh ripped from me. Not the polite kind, but raw disbelief. Sabine's smirk faltered. What's so funny, she snapped, shifting the bag to her other arm. Before I could answer, Dad's boots thundered down the hall. The door flew wide. His face was crimson, jaw tight, voice shaking the walls. Who stole my $20,000? Sabine froze, her color draining as quickly as it had once glowed. The bag slipped from her hand, spilling tissue paper across the rug. And in that frozen second, I knew the old balance in our house had cracked, and there would be no simple way back to the way things were. The morning after Dad's outburst, I left before the house stirred. The port was already awake, cranes stretching into the sky like iron trees, engines rumbling across the yard. I walked the rows of containers, clipboard in hand, checking seals, listening to radios crackle. My job was routine but steady, the kind of work that taught patience. Freight didn't move faster because you wanted it to. It moved when the tide, the paperwork, and the schedules aligned. I saved every extra dollar. Sometimes I skipped lunch, stashing the money into an account I rarely touched. Each deposit was a brick toward a plan I kept close one day, running my own small consultancy, helping shippers who didn't have the patience to deal with delays and codes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Sabine lived in a different world. She called it freedom. Nights in downtown Long Beach, cocktails under neon, mornings when she didn't rise until the sun was already high. Her social feeds were full of smiles, friends draped over her shoulder, captions about living in the moment, at home. She told stories of parties and chance encounters with people who just got her. My parents would laugh along, eyes glowing with pride. Sabine lights up a room, Dad said once, as if charm were currency. Mom always added, she'll find her way. She always does. I never heard the same said of me. My updates about a shipment clearing customs or a new process I'd streamlined earned polite nods. Nothing more. Hard work, it seemed, didn't sparkle the same way. I told myself I didn't care, that discipline mattered more than applause. But every time Sabine basked in their admiration while I was invisible, something in me tightened. Resentment was a quiet tide, pulling at the edges of what I thought I could endure. When the truth of the stolen card settled into the silence of our house, I knew that tide was finally shifting, and it was only a matter of time before it broke hard against us all. The credit card theft didn't come out of nowhere. It was only the largest wave in a tide that had been rising for years. I could trace it back to small things, bills I had set aside on my nightstand, 20s folded carefully, gone the next morning. At first, I thought I had miscounted or spent it without remembering, but the pattern repeated, each disappearance matching the days Sabine was flush with new trinkets or nights out. When I confronted her once, she tilted her head with that smile that always disarmed our parents. "Relax, Ione. I just borrowed it." "You're so uptight." She promised she'd pay me back, and sometimes she did, slipping a 5 into my hand weeks later, as if that evened the scales. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Mom played the mediator, reminding me we were sisters and money came and went. "Don't keep score," she would say, as though fairness was pettiness. Dad was harder to read. He valued work, but rarely scolded Sabine. When she charmed him with a story or hugged him after a night out, the issue dissolved. I was left holding my irritation like contraband, invisible to everyone else. Anger came first, but guilt always followed. Maybe I was too rigid, too serious, too unwilling to let things slide. Sabine's lightness made me look heavy by comparison, and part of me wondered if that was my fault. If I smiled more, joked more, would they see me differently? The card changed that. It was no longer a missing 20 or a flimsy excuse. It was thousands in luxury clothes, tickets, and a vacation I hadn't been invited to. It was evidence that the trail of small losses had led us straight to the edge of something we could not smooth over anymore. And as I watched Dad's face harden and Mom's voice falter, I knew the reckoning that had been postponed was finally at our door. That night, I sat at my desk with the card still lying where Dad had left it, the scrap of paper beside it like an accusation. I replayed the morning in my mind. Dad had leaned in, asked me to order the watch, and dropped both items in plain sight. I'd rushed out the door, telling myself it could wait until evening. I thought nothing of it when Sabine poked her head into my room later, claiming she needed my charger. She lingered longer than usual, eyes darting toward the desk before she finally left. The evidence was there now in black and white. Airline confirmations, hotel reservations, boutique purchases all charged to that card. A deposit at a beachside resort in Huntington, non-refundable. 2 airline tickets under Sabine's name, scheduled for the next morning. My pulse thudded as I scrolled. This wasn't a handful of bills, wasn't a few drinks bought with borrowed cash. This was fraud, committed with Dad's trust as collateral. I could almost hear her voice as she justified it to herself. The card was left out, the PIN written down. It was practically an invitation. That was Sabine's logic, bending reality until it served her. But invitations don't excuse theft, and carelessness doesn't justify betrayal. What unsettled me most wasn't just the money, it was how easy she made it look. No hesitation, no fear, only confidence that she'd get away with it. She'd walked into my space, taken what wasn't hers, and built a fantasy weekend on the foundation of someone else's work. I sat back in the chair, staring at the declining balance on the screen. Dad had trusted me with his account, and I had left the door open. Sabine had stepped through without a second thought. When her laughter floated down the hall later, I knew the confrontation waiting for us wasn't just about dollars. It was about every excuse, every dismissal, every time we had looked the other way. And now there was nowhere else left to look but directly at her. The hallway felt narrower than usual, the walls closing in as Dad's voice shook the air. Sabine stood there with her shopping bags still half open, her eyes darting between us like a trapped animal searching for an exit. "You spent it," Dad thundered, his hand clenched around the statement I had printed. $20,000. Do you think I work all these years so you can parade around in designer clothes and book vacations? Sabine's chin lifted, her old weapon of confidence flashing for a second. "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. Ione left the card sitting out. The pin was written right there. How is it only my fault if she practically invited trouble? Her words landed heavy, but not as heavy as they might once have. Dad's eyes flicked to me, waiting for my answer. My hands trembled as I passed him the printed receipts, each one marked with a timestamp. I was at the port all day, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Every charge matches the hours I was gone, and every single one is under her name. Airline tickets, hotel deposit, luxury boutiques, there's no mistaking who made them. Sabine's smile faltered. You're just twisting it? I didn't know it was Dad's card. I thought it was yours. Ione, I figured you wouldn't mind after everything you've hoarded. Dad's face hardened at that. He glanced at me, then back at her, and something in his expression shifted. For years he had laughed off her stories, brushed aside my quiet complaints, but now the weight of paper and numbers lay heavy in his hands. Undeniable. Mom appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, confusion clouding her face. What's happening? She asked, her eyes scanning us. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Dad handed her the receipts, and she read silently, her lips tightening. For the first time, the easy excuses didn't come. Sabine tried again. Softer now. Dad, it was just a mistake. I'll pay it back. But no one moved to shield her. The air in the hallway held a new balance, as if the ground itself had tilted beneath us. And in that silence, I knew the reckoning was only beginning. The house stayed tense for 2 days. Silence broken only by short commands and the closing of doors. Dad barely spoke at dinner, his eyes fixed on his plate. Mom moved carefully between us, as if one wrong word might spark another explosion. Sabine avoided me entirely, shutting herself in her room as though the hallway itself had become hostile ground. On the third night, Dad called us to the living room. He stood in front of the mantel, the credit card statement folded in his hand. His voice was steady now, no shouting, no wild anger, only a flat certainty. I won't press charges, he began, but this isn't disappearing. You stole $20,000. Sabine, you're going to pay it back. Sabine crossed her arms, already bristling. How you think I've got that kind of money lying around? You're going to work, he said. Every paycheck, every tip, every bonus, whatever you earn goes directly toward this debt until it's gone. Her laugh was short, brittle. You're serious. Yes, Dad answered, and to make sure there are no excuses. Ione will help draft the agreement. It'll be signed, witnessed, and clear. No more arguments. All eyes turned to me. I swallowed hard but nodded. That night I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing out a repayment plan that broke the sum into monthly installments. It wasn't fast, it would take years, but it was binding. When I handed the pages to Dad, he read every line, then slid them across the table toward Sabine. She skimmed them, her jaw tightening. This is ridiculous, she muttered. You're treating me like a criminal. You treated us like fools. Dad replied, now you'll make it right. For a long moment, I thought she might refuse. Then, with a sharp breath, she snatched the pen from the counter and scrawled her name at the bottom. The signature bled across the page, dark and uneven, but it was there. Dad folded the papers and tucked them into an envelope, sealing them as if closing a vault. The weight in the room shifted. Judgment had been passed, not in a court, but in our own living room, and the slow math of repayment had just begun. Sabine landed a job at a warehouse in Commerce, the kind of place where shifts ran 12 hours and the air smelled of dust and oil. Dad drove her there the first day, standing by the car until she walked through the metal doors. For once, he didn't smile or wave. He just waited until she disappeared inside, then turned the key in silence. The first week, she came home with blistered hands and a sour expression. She slammed her boots against the wall, muttering about supervisors who barked orders and coworkers who treated her like she was nobody. By the second week, she had already started arriving late. Traffic. She claimed, though everyone knew the bus ran on schedule. At night, I heard her pacing in her room, the clatter of hangers as she pulled clothes from her closet. Soon after, pieces of her new wardrobe began to vanish. I passed a second-hand shop on Anaheim Street one afternoon and saw one of the blouses in the window, tags still dangling. She was pawning off what had once been her trophies, each sale buying her enough to cover gas or groceries while the rest of her wages went straight into Dad's repayment envelope. Her social glow dimmed just as quickly. The friends who once flooded her phone with invitations grew quiet. Photos of crowded bars and late-night laughter stopped appearing on her feeds. When I walked by her room, I sometimes caught her scrolling old pictures, her face lit by a screen that no longer reflected the life she'd built for show. Mom, who had always been quick to soften the edges, no longer rushed to defend her. She cooked, cleaned, and carried on. But when Sabine complained about the unfairness of it all, Mom only pressed her lips together. It was as if the reservoir of excuses had finally run dry. Watching my sister shrink under the weight of her own choices, I felt something tangled, half relief, half pity. She had been untouchable for so long, the golden one, the light in every room. Now the shine was gone, and all that remained was the raw truth she could no longer hide. It happened on a Tuesday. Sabine walked in before noon, shoulders slumped, a folded letter in her hand. She didn't have to say it. The silence clung to her like dust from the warehouse floor. Dad read the page, eyes narrowing as he scanned the words, termination for repeated lateness, failure to follow instructions, lack of performance. He set the letter on the table without speaking. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking clock above the fridge. Then he said, calm but final, "You're out of chances. You find new work immediately, or you leave this house." Sabine's mouth opened, ready to argue, but Mom cut her off not with words of comfort, but with a quiet, trembling nod. "Your father's right," she said. "We can't keep pretending this isn't what it is." The room seemed to tilt. For years, Mom had been Sabine's shield, smoothing over her mistakes, translating them into harmless phases. To hear her side with Dad left Sabine blinking, as though the ground had given way beneath her feet. I spoke carefully, not wanting to strike when she was already down. "There are listings at the port for clerical assistants. It's not glamorous, but it's steady. And I know a woman in Wilmington who rents shared rooms cheap if you need a place closer to work." Her eyes snapped to mine, raw with indignation. "You'd kick me out too. I'm not kicking you anywhere," I said. "But I'm not paying your bills." "You need a plan, not another excuse." She shoved the letter back into her bag, muttering under her breath. Dad didn't rise, didn't yell, just sat there, hands folded, waiting for her to choose. The threshold had been drawn, clear and cold, and for the first time, no one in the family rushed to blur the line for her. The night before she left, Sabine moved through the house quietly, gathering what she could fit into a single duffel. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just the soft thud of drawers closing and the rasp of a zipper pulled too far. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to each sound travel through the walls. By dawn, Dad drove us all downtown. The Greyhound station smelled of exhaust and stale coffee. Sabine stood near the platform, clutching her bag, eyes fixed on the bus idling with its doors open. For once, she looked small, the gloss gone from her posture. None of us spoke. Relief and sorrow wove together, thick in the silence. Part of me wanted to hug her, but the memory of every stolen bill, every smirk when she brushed off my anger, held me still. Dad's jaw was set, unyielding. It was Mom who finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, meant more for herself than for us. I should have seen it sooner. I made excuses, always saying she'd grow out of it. I thought loving her meant shielding her. But maybe I only fed the fire. Sabine turned then, eyes flicking toward Mom. Then me, then Dad. For a second, I thought she might say something, but she only gave a faint nod and climbed the steps. The hiss of the doors closing filled the station, followed by the rumble of the engine pulling away. We stood there watching until the bus became a streak of gray merging with traffic. No one moved, as if leaving space for what had just passed between us. The air felt lighter and heavier all at once. And in that strange balance, I realized life inside our house would not look the same again. Weeks passed, and the house settled into a rhythm I hadn't known before. Meals were quieter, but not strained, just steady, like the tide rolling in and out without disruption. Dad returned from the shop each evening and actually lingered at the table, asking about my day. One night, after I told him about a successful shipment I'd coordinated, he set down his fork and said, "You've never failed me." I should have said that sooner. The words landed heavier than I expected, and for a long moment I couldn't answer. Mom changed too. Instead of circling around conflict, she started volunteering at a small financial literacy clinic near Signal Hill, teaching families how to protect themselves from fraud and debt. When she came home with pamphlets tucked under her arm, her eyes had a new clarity. "I want to make sure no one else lets love blind them to the truth," she told me, almost as if she were speaking to herself. As for me, I finally signed my first client for the consultancy I'd been planning for years. It wasn't glamorous, just a mid-sized shipping firm frustrated with customs delays, but it was mine. I rented a modest office corner in Signal Hill, the windows looking out over the cranes in the distance, and felt a kind of ownership I'd never known. The repayment contract still sat in my desk drawer at home, Sabine's signature etched across the bottom. I didn't keep it as a weapon or a reminder of her failure. I kept it because it proved something I had learned the hard way: boundaries were not acts of revenge. They were anchors, holding fast against storms. And with that anchor set, I could finally steer toward a different kind of harbor,